Meaghan Thumath is a practicing nurse, clinical assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, and the regional director of communicable disease control at Vancouver Coastal Health. She holds a Master's of Science in Public Health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a Ph.D. from the University of Oxford as a Trudeau scholar. Meaghan is an active member of the World Health Organization's WHO Emergencies program, with recent deployments to support the COVID-19 response in South Africa and the Ebola responses in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I invited Meaghan on the program to share her expertise on the topic of harm reduction policies here in North America. During our time together, we talk about her experience as a street nurse, her own purview on the topic of substance abuse, and her hope of a dignified national approach to assist our growing homeless and addicted populations worldwide. Meaghan's love and attention to our world's most marginalized communities is even more impressive than her storied experience in education. I hope you learn as much from her as I did. Well, there we are, Meaghan Thumath. Thank you so much for joining me today on True 30. I really appreciate you coming.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Well, after we met in the summit late last year, I was beyond impressed with your clinical work as a child welfare, addiction, and marginalized women's health expert. And as I shared with you in the desert, I have personal interest in addiction and substance abuse because my family lost my little brother in 2007. So I wanted to talk to an expert like yourself about the remedies of my city, specific to substance abuse, homelessness, addiction here in San Francisco, as well as many other cities here in North America that are utilizing a program called harm reduction. And it's something you know quite a bit about from your training, both as a nurse and now an academic and clinical professor at School of Nursing at the University of British Columbia. So, can you help out my listeners in understanding what harm reduction is, where it came from, and then we can kind of get into why it's so uniformly adopted in North America, and then talk about like what's working with it and what's not. That would really be helpful.
Would love to have this conversation.
Okay, cool.
And I think, we really share the passion. I mean, I myself have some lived experience with substance use and came to the work through that. And one of my first jobs was at a needle and syringe program, which is kind of often how people think of harm reduction. So harm reduction is about reducing the unintended harms of illicit substances. Primarily, it started in that movement and has expanded beyond, but harms of substance use and the impacts of prohibition on people's lived lives, and coming at people with a sense of love and compassion.
Yeah,
and it's a really a public health approach to drug policy, and I think would love to have a conversation about the broader drug policies that it shouldn't stand in isolation. And so I think that's something I often talk about with whether it's families or clients that I'm working with. But it's really the way we keep people alive. Like you, I'm so sorry for your experience with your brother, and that's
thanks.
Sadly so many people's experiences. And I think harm reduction is both a way to keep people alive, where they can have that bridge to recovery. It's really hard to get well and to reconnect with your family and your work and your loved ones if you've had a fatal overdose. So that's at its core one of the main reasons that harm reduction is there, and it's a way really of people just understanding and coming at people with love. Love is actually often in some of the more formal definitions.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. Yeah, because let me read this. This is from the Harm Reduction International. It says harm reduction encompasses a non-judgmental approach combined with a range of health and social services. These include, but not limited to, drug consumption rooms, also called overdose prevention centers or supervised consumption sites, where drugs can be consumed under supervision, housing, and employment initiatives, which do not require abstinence as a precondition, drug checking services, where people can check illegal drugs for alternatives, overdose prevention and reversal, psychosocial support, and the provision of information on safer drug use. Harm reduction refers to policies, programs, and practices that aim to minimize the negative health, social, and legal impacts associated with drug use. So that was from the international .org piece. And so that coupled with what you're talking about, I watched a couple of your symposiums online where you talk specifically to this, and when you were teaching one of your nursing classes about this. How is it? Where did it come from? Where did harm reduction originate?
I think it's often understood to have originated in Liverpool, England. Some folks talk about the early movement in Sydney, Australia as well. And really, it came from people with lived experience fighting against overdose. And Vancouver, my city where I live, also had a lot of fatal overdoses, heroin overdoses, and they are reversible. You know, you don't have to die from an opioid overdose. There is something called naloxone that reverses it. And we know that one of the other reasons people overdose is because their drugs are contaminated. And so other early movements so that's what an overdose prevention site or a supervised consumption site really does. It makes sure that you're not using alone and that there's someone there to save you. But what often is not as understood is what a critical gateway that is to health and social services, which are really what will ultimately, allow people to lead a more fulfilling life and reconnect with family. And so when I was a nurse at Insight, which is one of the first supervised consumption sites in North America, it was, what's missed in the headlines and what people think we're enabling is actually the day-to-day interactions with people who use drugs, who just see, oh, this person, unlike their experience on the street where people are just angry with them or frustrated that they're homeless. They get to come inside, they get to be warm, they get to make eye contact, they get to have a cup of coffee. And all of those are part of the therapeutic intervention. And we actually have a traditional detox on the second floor, and a women's only space as well, which many people don't realize. So when people say, hey, I need a break from the street, I'm ready. It's not that it's a binary, like we believe in harm reduction and we don't believe in recovery. It's that it's actually a gateway, a very low barrier gateway above there. And I saw that time and time again, people that the system had given up on, that people felt had really profound schizophrenia and that they weren't, capable of living a traditional life, like actually have some break from their substance use, particularly if there was stimulants, and then clear, get upstairs, reconnect with their children, reconnect with loved ones. You meet the most amazing people in our inner cities, and they're just like you and I. Like, they are our brothers and sisters, and they are, like, I often felt, I'm not religious, but for the grace of God go I, as also someone that had struggled with substance use. So, more and more families have this experience, and whether it's a coworker or a colleague, and understanding that harm reduction can be also about being open and non-judgmental, even within your own family. That list doesn't have heroin prescription trials, which are heroin prescription, or other fentanyl prescribing, which is also sometimes called safe supply. And that's another intervention where not only are you just able to reverse an overdose, you can prevent it by eliminating like the toxic element of the drug supply. And that's something we did at the North American Opiate Medication Initiative, or NIOMI, which was our first clinical trial based on the experiences in Switzerland, where we found that people were then able to get street crime decreased in the Swiss studies and in ours. There was, again, less homelessness. People didn't have to engage in the drug trade or survival sex work because they were no longer hustling for their next fix. And they were able to actually get a clean, safe supply, and people could function, and they could start to reconnect with their health care, start to deal with things they'd missed, start to get their mental health cleared, and then start to reengage with family. And I'm just a big believer of, substances are criminalized often not because they're dangerous, but it's actually the criminalization that leads to some of the most unintended harms, like the breaking and entering and people being constantly cycling in and out of jail. That doesn't help. Like, we know that jail itself is a traumatic place. I don't know if your family ever went through this, but again, it's not a good safe space. It's not a good place for your mental health. And when we criminalize addiction, we're really giving people, just sending them further into this spiral.
Agreed. And I watched my little brother go in and out of jail for decades. So it sucked because he'd go in and he'd come out worse. Sometimes he'd come out beat up. He always came out scared. And I don't want to go back, Joe, is what I always say. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want you to go back either, buddy. But, when you do illegal things, the police throw you in jail. That's just kind of how it is. And so I talked with Christina Soto DeBerry, and I think you met her at the summit as well. And for those of you who didn't watch this episode, she is the founder of Progressive Prosecutors Alliance here in California, and she has a storied history with, as a prosecutor and working with Gaston and working with Governor Newsom, and just a rock star here. And she's part of this belief, that we need to be more gentle. And progressive prosecutors are actually now meeting with the victims in this case and talking with both the victim and the assailant and saying, hey, I'm going to put you guys together. We're going to try and deal with this. And based on the fact that you just mentioned is the recidivism rates are so high of going into jail once you get out. So the one thing we know, and this is just in all literature, it's very hard for anyone to agree on anything today in our culture, specifically here in America. Mm-hmm. But everyone agrees that our prisons need to be reformed and that our jails are a mess and that it's not a real good alternative. And so, what we do have here on the political bifurcation is that on the Republican side of our body politic, there's more of a focus on punitive damages, specific to, hey, if you do something wrong, you deserve to be in prison. And there's some really valid arguments specific to San Francisco right now and the Los Angeles and Seattle and Portland because of these huge drug air markets that we have. I drive through it every day when I take my little boys to school. So it's something that is very present in my life. And what are your thoughts on the the issue of housing first part of the program? Mm-hmm. And if so, what do you think about the Housing First initiative when it comes to harm reduction?
I think it's a crucial part of the puzzle. I mean, I would say they're not. There's really companion philosophies, and Housing First is a ton of literature behind it. I mean, it's one of those things like, it's funny but we actually have community level trials, randomized control trials. So our highest level of, quality of scientific evidence on the approach. And many of them found, earlier ones were done, I believe, in Chicago and across the US. And we actually did one in Vancouver and Montreal ours was called Chez Soi, which is French for at home. And I was also part of that as well. And so the teams really found that if you gave people, they looked at different scattered site housing models where people were supported by a team, and they looked at congregate settings where people were together. And again, both were really found to be effective to reduce, corrections and prison experiences, reduce violence, reduce substance use. Again, people got jobs, like every really metrics that you can find people do better when they have a roof over your head. Like if you've never been homeless, it's really hard to imagine, but how do you survive? Like you're too filthy to go to a job interview.
Right.
You have a shower. You're scared, especially if you're a woman or a young person, and you're racialized to sleep. So you start to use stimulants to stay awake because otherwise you might experience sexual assault or violence. Right. Then your brain's spinning out of control, and you need down to calm you down, and you're just in this cycle. And not every homeless person uses drugs, but a lot of people end up doing it partly because of the despair. And it can happen that, again, I feel that's something that can happen to anyone. You meet people, they have PhDs, they're artists, they're very creative. What many of them have in common is some element of trauma. And we know from literature when we talk to people, there often was a trauma of origin with people who have very, very severe and persistent substance use disorder and who are really living on the margins. And so these people were children at some point, and whether it was something happened with a sports coach, and that's rife in the world, or something happened with a family member. And so they often have this sort of sadness that they're trying to mask with substance. That doesn't mean, again, everybody who uses substances has substance use disorder. Many people use it socially. And so it's partly unpacking like what is causing these big, as someone that also lives in a city that struggles, I know it's frustrating for my neighbors, and they think like, what is this open air drug market, or am I safe doing this? And what we try and think through is there are solutions. And I think people sometimes think their city has implemented harm reduction. But again, I would say no one should implement it in isolation. In Canada, we often talk about the 4 pillars. And that was something brought from the European experience as well. And so that's harm reduction, prevention. So, as a parent myself as well, I don't want my 13-year-old to have access to prescription heroin. So I want him to know about drugs in a safe way, but I also want him to have access to good education. Treatment is the 3rd pillar. And then the 4th pillar is enforcement. And I don't love enforcement. It's a little bit of it's an older concept, the 4 pillars. They were developed, I want to say 10, 15 years ago. And I think you can I would replace that sort of with dignity and, elements of like good stewardship in your neighborhood. So an example I would give is when we opened Insight, we developed really good partnerships with local police and the local business association and our Chinatown, and our neighbors in Chinatown. Lots of ethnic Chinese community had very big concerns about the approach. They had immigrated from China. They felt like, open drugs, this is a bad idea. And we worked really carefully with those neighbors to say, this will help clean up the street. And users of Insight, we developed a peer model where they were involved in managing the chill themselves, and they had some accountability, and they swept the street. They swept out needles, and kind of the founders of Insight. It wasn't my idea. It was Mark and Liz, the great founders. He was actually had come over from the UK, but Mark understood very well that if you did not show the neighbors the value of the model, that they wouldn't support it, but also that people needed to learn what it meant to have dignity and be sort of reminded. And people were appreciative. Like, people don't want to be undignified. Like, it's such a foundation of life. And so it's also about having those paid opportunities for people to get onto the job market ladder in a low barrier way. It's about having everything together. And Portugal's often talked about as one of the leaders in that. They had both harm reduction, they had safe supply, but they also had, if you wanted treatment and recovery, quite good access to that. And so I think you need the spectrum. Housing, to me, and a good social thing. I think in the European models, it's hard for us as North Americans to sometimes imagine that's the strength of their social safety net. At the time when they were implementing these trials was huge. And so there again, like, people had a housing first approach because they had access to housing when they needed it.
Correct. And do you mention Portugal? Because Portugal and Amsterdam are often discussed, in literature as case studies that worked. And what I've noticed, and I'm a layperson in this, so I've done very little homework.
No.
I've probably spent, 50 hours researching this conversation. And then obviously I spent a lot of time in and out of rehab centers, and my little brother talking to caseworkers and asking them what their treatment systems were. And over the last 20 years, those are the models. Portugal specifically talks about, and Amsterdam too, what they had in common was that they did have the housing first, but it wasn't necessarily permanent housing. It was sheltered housing. And to your point, it was congregate housing. So they had additional people there, but they also had the police that checked in with them. And one of the pieces that I thought was weird and actually kind of neat, because they admitted some of the difficulty, was that in Amsterdam, they had difficulty actually getting the police to come on board with this harm reduction idea. And then once they got that across, then this duo, if you will, went out and did it together. But it wasn't just police. It was parole officers, caseworkers, social workers, psychologists, judges, employers. Everyone kind of collectively came in, swooped in to help these people. And the police did shut down the open air drug scenes. That was part of it. They went around and said, hey, if you were more than 4 or 5, they broke you up. They didn't arrest you. But they're like, guys, you can't do this as a group. Go find some place together or do it by yourself. They didn't arrest them, but they give them tickets, right? And said, hey, you need to pay this fine for doing this. And a lot of times they didn't have the fine. And so they would get a warrant. And then when they got to trial or in front of a magistrate, the judge would say something to the effect of, hey, we know you're an addict. We want to help you. Therapy's mandatory. or jail.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we sit. Now, that's, again, just a very brief analysis of those two areas, Portugal and Amsterdam. Do you guys do that in Vancouver? Do you, kind of circle the wagons and get all these wonderful, clinicians and experts and care workers together as a group and work with the individuals? Or is it, yeah?
Yeah, we have something similar called drug courts. So they're based a little bit on I think it might have been Seattle, but we had learned from their model and a few others.
Minnesota too, because my cousin went through it, and she sadly passed away after she got out of drug court. And when she graduated from drug court, she cried and told my cousin, my first cousin, that she wasn't going to make it because she needed this help. Yeah. And she OD'd on a really bad, it was fentanyl, 6 months later. So I have heard of drug courts, and they're very similar. There's really not funded here in America, by the way. I mean, there's prototypes, throughout the country, but they're very, very underfunded. And it's just gobsmacked when I read, because it seems to work. So I'm sorry to interrupt. Tell me about.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, certainly there are pros and cons to everything. And I think as an interim measure, they can certainly help change people's approach with criminalization and give them options. And I think everyone is so unique. Like, I have colleagues and friends who had experience with drug court that were really valuable, and they felt like they needed that push. And I've had patients. I worked at a place called Sheway that's really wonderful. That's a harm reduction approach for women who use drugs during pregnancy, which is a really complex group to support. Yeah. And I had some patients who would say, I'd say, oh, this physician is here today. Are you ready to see them? And they would say, oh, that physician's too soft. Like, I want to see the strict physician that's in tomorrow. But okay. So they actually wanted someone that really kept them accountable and did the urine drug screens, and was really, they chose that, and that's what they needed. But then I had the opposite sometimes, like a very, traumatized woman that didn't connect with that particular style, and would say, sure, oh, if that physician's here, I'm going to wait for the other one that I want to see tomorrow. And both were valid. So I think that people's recovery journey is so complex that you do need options. But in terms of drug court, I would say what we're moving towards now is a new approach that we actually just introduced, I think 2 days ago. We're the first jurisdiction in Canada to officially decriminalize small levels of personal substance use, so heroin, cocaine, etc. And we did that, and it's a bit of an experiment. It was an agreement with our national government, and it's something that we asked to do because we wanted to understand what it would look like to remove that criminal element altogether. So what the police now will do in our jurisdiction is actually they will continue to break people up, and again keep that sense of neighborhood security and safety, but they'll be giving people like referral cards to treatment. This doesn't apply. I mean, it's really about personal substance use. So it's a small amount. So it's sort of a crack in the window. But I think what the other thing to think about in other cities, like what you're describing, is like, what would it look like not just thinking about jail options, but what would it look like if you didn't have to congregate there? Because the reason people congregate is because they're homeless. So back to your housing first. And many of the shelters, San Francisco is not unlike my city, Vancouver, where these single room occupancy hotels were built. The history of these inner cities, again, they were like low income workers. Some of them, mine was an opium den. The city put everything in that one area, and they have no living room. They're not allowed to have guests. They're not allowed to have their friends over to have a beer in their room like you and I do, or middle class people might do their cocaine in their living room. They don't have a living room. And so that's why they're congregating. And again, so it's sort of like, could we create safe spaces that are welcoming, that have the things that people need? Could they be, you try to go in a coffee shop, if you haven't had a chance to have a shower or you want to use the bathroom, you're turned away. Sure. There's unwelcoming lights you can't use inside. So we create all these barriers, and then we're surprised that everyone's gathering outside. And it's like, is drug court the solution, or is welcoming neighborhoods and having you mentioned, I think it's a great point. What they did in Europe was everybody came along. And if you want to have a serious approach to controlling open air drug markets, or concerns of safety of residents. Like, you need the businesses to be like, you know what, if someone wants to come and have a shower here, that's okay. Like, you need private sector engaged. You need people to sort of shift their thinking and from othering people and being a bridge. And if an employer start to change their approach to substance use, like, I understand you have patterns where people are drug tested as part of their work. And then again, what happens to that person? They lose their job. They become homeless. You're just kind of furthering this attitude. And it's not really the drugs that are the problem. It's the criminalization and the othering and the lack of sort of thinking of it as, oh, this is a trigger for help for this person.
It's a good point. So just to share with you, because I interviewed my cousin about this, but her drug court was 2 group meetings on substance each week. Once a week with a psychiatrist, 1 or 2 meetings with the police officer who came to her house, which I thought was really cool. And they would just talk. He would just kind of see how she was living and how you doing, and are you feeling better this week? And then this allowed her to re-engage with her children, to connect with her mom and dad, her family, all of that. And so it was really neat. And then obviously the collateral positivity there is that she was then hired to work as not a therapist, but someone inside the rehab center because she could relate. Right. And so she felt purpose again. And so everything was going great. And she then paid taxes and she came, she got back into life, if you will. And then it ended, as I said, because you graduated, we need to move on. And then she was terrified. And my brother was terrified every time he walked out of therapy. So I would pick him up sometimes after, and I'm not a big fan of 30-day programs because they just don't work. And it's not because they're not trying, the compassionate lens on all of these people is everyone's trying. But it's one of those things where after decades of 28-day programs having a 17% efficacy, it's one of those things where you have to that doesn't work. And is it 30 days? Is it 60 days? It's 90 days doesn't really work either. It's actually kind of, I think the one thing that I've seen as far as a central thread of success is Portugal, Amsterdam, drug courts, because it is a collective and it is less punitive.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like you screwed up, you're going to prison. It's, hey, we did a urinalysis and obviously we found drugs. So we need you to go back to therapy. I think, what do you think about mandatory therapy as opposed to mandatory jail? Is there any benefit to that level of requirements, or I don't want to say punitive, but some kind of consequence?
I mean, I think the one thing I would say would be a first step before mandatory treatment is a piece you haven't talked about, and I'm curious if your cousin or your brother experienced this, is an interim step, I would call it, which is opioid agonist therapy or substitution therapy. If it's a stimulant that they use, there's also stimulant substitution, and that's really where I think the evidence is pointing us towards, as opposed to these residential programs. Certainly, some people have benefited, and I hate to discount them because I know some people feel that, it really was life-changing, and that's wonderful. But what happens when you go into a detox and then into a 30-day program is then you have a 30-day period of abstinence, and just physiologically, pure science, your body loses its tolerance for whatever of choices, which is for many people opioids in the case of overdose. And so you have this period of tolerance where you now, if you relapse or decide to use substances again, which is really normal and common. And you know what? I don't know. I drink coffee. I drink alcohol. Like, I use substances as well. And so it's just so common in modern society. And really, it's quite an ancient practice for people to use substances to alter their consciousness of some some form. And so if you again, to normalize substances, you maybe you got something out of that bit of heroin that you need because it soothes something for you. And what we know is people will get out of these detoxes and then they'll use their old dose and they're
done.
And they pass away. And so what the interim step is, and what we prefer now, and why we prefer even outpatients for that reason, is an agonist. So whether that's methadone, we have much more modern ones like Suboxone now with less side effects.
Suboxone was, my brother used that. And I remember, this was, he died in 2007. So there's been a lot of good change since then.
There's injectable options, which you can sort of choose. Like if some of the injectables are quite harsh, and that if you take it, you feel sick. But again, I'm a big fan of patient choice. And if the patient's like, I want that, I want the more stronger control on me, and some will choose some of the injectable options that again make them sick, and others will say, I don't want that, I want the oral. And so making these really low barrier and accessible, and again free, like many people can't afford them, they should be freely available. They should be something that people have access to. There are options now for stimulant users. Many stimulant users have ADHD and it's undiagnosed, and again, like an Adderall prescription can be life-changing for them. And people have spent their youth, looking for a high because they were actually, that helps them think. So underneath every substance use is often a very smart idea. Most people who use drugs are actually not smart, and they're trying to get either their brain to a function level because they're neurodivergent, or they're trying to quiet something in their mind. Or if you're a heroin user and you're dope sick, it's actually like really painful. Right. And it hurts and you're throwing up and you have diarrhea. And so is it really that crazy that you are going to get another injection that will stop that feeling? It's actually quite rational. And so if we can give people these substitution therapies, again, that are prescription, it's life-changing, and it prevents overdose, because again, they can't overdose when they're on many of these, because some of them have actually some naloxone built into them. Again, and more for people who are interested in that, that's when you can go to sort of the prescription heroin, which we get from Europe again, and you take out the fentanyl, which is a toxic, made in a lab. It's a pollutant. It's now in opioids. It's now in some of people's benzodiazepines. The market is tainted, and so you have to kind of tackle this in a multi-pronged way. But for me, that's a better solution than often forcing people down. Where I often see this system in other cities, and it confuses me, is like they're going to the drug court, which is really expensive, or they're going to these big treatment models, but they still haven't enabled the foundation, which is really housing and outpatient, effective, evidence-based substance use treatment. And I was really lucky to do my addictions medicine fellowship at our BC Centre for Substance Use. And part of that group's purpose is to help train providers, because we don't get training in addiction in most medical schools and nursing schools, in social work schools. Like, this should be something that every family physician can prescribe. We have nurse prescribing now. It should be free. And that's what really helps create that layer. So if you come in to emerge for pain, that the physician should be able to help you, because that can be a gateway. Or if you encounter an officer in the street, they should be able to refer you. And it's so much cheaper because it's not residential. And the other thing I like about outpatient treatment is it's not taking you out of your environment. So you don't have this, like, I was in this overly safe container and now I'm really, you actually stay in your community. And if you're a parent, if you're a mother, you don't have to put your children into foster care, which you may never get back. You can, they can go to school. You can go to your outpatient daytime counseling, because counseling is important. The roots of everything is important. But often in these very expensive, I see families mortgage their houses. And what actually is needed is peers. You talked about the power of peers, and for your cousin, the power and that she felt when she had the opportunity to give back. That's huge.
It is.
Volunteering is, at one point, the trial that I was working on for heroin, they asked us to stop. We were letting the participants, or not letting, but at the participants' request, they wanted to give back and they wanted to help. And so we had to amend the trial protocol in order so that they could work as peers in the thing. And I think at one point ethics wrote back oh no, you can't have them involved in cleaning the space because it's polluting the effect of the actual drug, which was your original research question. But we just had to push back because we just saw, we couldn't take away, there was a participant who wanted to sweep, and that actually gave him the step on the ladder. And he was like, now I'm going to get a cleaning job. And I think it's just so much more complicated than the drug. And all of this is, if someone's struggling to support someone, I would just say, the tough love and the rock bottom rarely works. And it's about getting them into a new environment.
I just anecdotally, I tried the tough love once with Stevie, my little brother, and he went to jail for 6 months. And I said, dude, I'm not talking to you for 6 months. I'm just not. I'm not going to visit you. I'm not going to write you. And he wrote me these hilarious letters, which I still have. He's like, "Hey, ass face, I know you're not talking to me, but I love you. And, I'm in blah, blah, blah." And it didn't work. And the neat thing is when the last week of his life, he was here with me in San Francisco, and he had been clean for 3.5 months. And to your point, this is what happened is that we took him down to a rehab center and talked with a couple of the counselors. And I said, I would really like my little brother to be here as in whatever capacity, if he can help people talk, if he can help just because he's been here and done that. And they loved him. He was very charismatic, and he had a big heart, and he loved people, and he suffered. So he really understood the pain other people were going through. And so we left that center, and I was like, "Buddy, you're going to be great here." And he wanted us to come back in 3 months. He wanted us to make sure he was clean and all of that. And he passed away about 5 days later. And it was heartbreaking because it was exactly that. His body had let go of some of the ability to absorb the amount of drugs and alcohol that he shoved down his gullet. And it was just too much, and so he died. And it was one of those things where this is, again, my bias. And this is why I'm, so in love with these programs. But let me just throw some of the statistics out that I get from my conservative friends. From 2005 to 2020, San Francisco experienced an astonishing 95% increase in unsheltered homelessness as the number of permanent supportive housing offered by the city rose from 6,000 to 10,000. San Francisco has the greatest number of permanent supporting houses per capita of any major city in the U.S. It has 11 permanent supportive housing units per 1,000 people, which is nearly 3 times as much as New York City. And we have 93% of the people in our community of that 8,000 have mental illness. 80% use cocaine, speed, or heroin, or get drunk to the point of unconsciousness. And so we, in our city, in 2001, we used to give away stipend to these folks of $395 a month. Today, we give $687 a month, $200 in food stamps, and it has become somewhat of a beacon for other addicts to come here and get the money, get a place to live, get the drugs, the clean pipes, the clean needles, and all of that. What is your response to that level of pushback from our politicians here in San Francisco, as well as Portland, Seattle, and Los Angeles? Is that we're not what we're doing is not working, right? It's actually getting worse. And so if these what is the response? Because I don't have.
It's a great question, and I think I can't speak for San Francisco because it's not my jurisdiction. But I live and know intimately a very similar city. So Vancouver has a lot in common with San Francisco. It's the warmest city in Canada. You can sleep outside year round. We're a temperate rainforest, and you're a little warmer than us, but not much. Right. And we also have we face very similar criticisms, and certainly have lots of colleagues there. So I know a bit about what you go through. And the thing is also you have to situate every city in their historical context. Like San Francisco, we're a port city in Vancouver. So again, we're a gateway to drugs, which again is geography. Like some of it is partly luck for many of the cities you mentioned. Seattle is not too dissimilar, and others. It's like the climate, the geography, all of those things, and our histories. I can speak to my city and our colonial history with Indigenous people. White settlers came here, very brutal treatment. Many people in British Columbia put into these residential schools, lots of trauma, lots of sexual abuse. These ended in 1986. So not unlike some of the racialized experiences that Black Americans have in your cities. Again, you'll see people overrepresented from ethnic minorities, and
no question
in these things because they're, part of it is a legacy of white supremacy and colonization. And so these are all intertwined. You can't sort of take that context out of it. And so in our inner city, you'll see a real overrepresentation of Indigenous Canadians that are there from with really the after effects of colonization in my city. So those are some of the big things I say. Again, it's not about part of it is the luck of the city. And then again, it's doing things in half measures. Like you mentioned, $687 per month and $200 in food stamps. Well, I've been to San Francisco. I don't think that gets you very far. And so again, and what is a drop in a bucket? And versus an actual universal basic income. That's something that's often used in Europe. Lots of research on that. If people don't have to hustle and they can, have a roof over their heads and they don't have to steal, what would that look like? And that's very different than giving people a tiny bit of money, which is what we do as well, by the way. We give people,
Okay.
we are after, I think, San Francisco, the most expensive housing market in North America. There is not a single family home here for under $1.5 million. Rent is a minimum $3,000 a month. And I think we give people like, I don't know, $800 or something. Like, you just simply can't. If you have a criminal record, which is another reason I have concerns sometimes around drug courts, it's like, yes, you might be able to get a peer job, but where are you going to go to next? If you have a criminal record, most places that you cannot get employment, can't even get employment as cleaner. Like, it really sets you up for this, like, knock you down again and again. So now you've got a criminal record. What else can you do other than deal or be involved in survival sex work or petty crime? And so you sort of see these patterns. And so what would it look like if we took the 4 pillars? And I'll go back to those. And that's maybe something for whether you're a conservative or a Democrat. Like, again, many parties can agree. You need not just one thing. Like, you need to address people's basic human needs to survive. And that's kind of some of the harm reduction. You need to keep those people alive. So you need harm reduction. You need to have safe spaces, get them out of the cold. You need prevention because you want to stop people entering the system as youth. And that's education and environment. You need treatment. I'm not sure how your treatment access is, but I'm imagining probably it's
lacking.
Free. Like, again, it needs to be free, accessible, and available. And then you need this enforcement or a more dignified way for people to be, and streets need to be, people need to feel safe in their communities. And I go back to, like, it's not always popular in my movement, and this could kind of get clipped out of context. So it's almost hard to talk about, but I learned from the old school harm reductionists that I was trained under, that came from Liverpool, again, that came from the European Swiss heroin trial models. The Swiss talked about this. I've been to Switzerland. I've been to Portugal. Portuguese talk about it. Like, not having open needles everywhere. Like, you need to show the community that when their children go to the playground, they are not accidentally going to get pricked with a needle. You need to be picking the needles up. And people who use drugs don't want to accidentally infect a child or have, something. They don't want that either. So there needs to be boxes for them. They need to be empowered to recover the needles. You need to give them needle sticks and give them peer jobs to do that. And so it's partly having that as a package. And many cities have just done one or the other. And I don't know as much about the harm reduction model in San Fran, but I know that, people will cherry pick data and everything. And it's possible that, I don't know, you need to know what the burden of, maybe you have the most social housing, but is it accessible? Do you have to be clean to be in some of that? Because again, then you can't actually enter it. I see this all the time with domestic violence shelters, women trying to flee, and trans folks trying to flee violence, and they're not allowed. They've used substances to cope with that violence, and then often it's a barrier to entry. And so then their children and them just have to live in this situation. And it's not, as these shelters are also, like, not all they're cracked up to be. Not all of them are run with dignity at their core. I think the best ones, some of them you're forced to pray if you're Muslim and you have to pray in a Christian shelter. How does that fit with your core beliefs? Some of them you have to line up for hours. Many of them you can't have the same bed each night. And so they're just, again, these chips away at your dignity, and they're doing the best they can. And they've set up, sometimes procedures because they're underfunded and undersupported, but they're not like, oh wow, it's just so great to sleep in a shelter every night.
That's the big argument here, specific to shelters versus permanent housing, because a lot of this, Jennifer, I think Friedenbach, who's the executive director of the San Francisco Coalition of Homeless, is a huge housing first advocate. And I think for that reason, similar to that, I did a bunch of reporting on defund the police over the last year. And so I interviewed a lot of beat cops in San Francisco and Santa Rosa, which is a big city north of here. And a lot of and these are, again, this may be qualitative research versus quantitative in that aspect, but maybe I talked to 20 officers, and specifically here in San Francisco, I would ask them about the open air drug market in the Tenderloin, which is our biggest area of problem. And we have, I think it's about 80% of our overdoses come from that one concentrated area. And I know you are aware of concentration issues when it comes to city, but we had in that area. So if you look at like Phoenix, Chicago, Seattle, there were 23 per 100 in Seattle, 46 per 100 out of Phoenix, 48 in Chicago, and 81 out of 100,000 here in San Francisco on overdoses. So our overdoses have gone through the roof over the last 10 years based on the policies. And to your earlier question, there are no requirements at all for sheltered housing or permanent housing. And that fits with your model, because that way you don't have to, they don't feel lack of dignity. They don't worry about being kicked out based on drug use, which is the only way they're coping. The counter argument to that is that if you allow, and my brother and his buddies used to joke about this, is that they gave me a stipend, they gave me a place to do the drugs, they gave me a clean pipe, and they gave me money. What do they think I'm going to do? Right? So that, when he was sober, he'd make jokes like that. And I'd say, well, obviously that's not the reason for all of that. But that begs the question specifically to, is there, because I like what you're talking about specifically of getting them off the detox. So the first is, let's detox them so that they don't, or so they can actually use drugs to stay, clean drugs to get better and start to, do you wean them, by the way? Is that something that happens?
Yeah. So often, different people need different things, but the first step when people come in is, starting them on a titration. So there's, depending on if it's about methadone, so we titrate people to the right level. And sometimes people, are a little more sleepy, and they maybe are in a stage where they need that. And that you'll sometimes still see people seeming in the zone, and then they'll start to feel better. And it's like, okay, I actually want to work and I feel too sleepy. Yeah. I work in construction. I need to be able to drive a forklift. And so you start to, get down to a level where they can really function. And, I don't know, do you have overdose prevention sites or supervised consumption sites?
We do. Yeah. And that's also criticized in the sense that, you're just giving people drugs. And these are just people that, the average person is not aware of these very complex problems. Right. So I understand, because we had billboards here that, took a bunch of crap from people, because the billboards actually said something to the effect of, do not use alone, go find your friends and do your drugs together, and I'm paraphrasing. Do not inject anymore if there's a higher level of overdose. So smoke or inhale, whatever it may be. And so these were billboards that were put up for that exact purpose in that neighborhood, because we were losing a lot of people that were doing drugs alone. And that's one of those things where if you titrate the person, it gets to a point where they can then bring back some clarity of thought. They start to work again. You get them down to either a level of very minimal drug use or off all drugs. And at that point, is there ever a good idea for some level of responsibility or a requirement, if you will? So like, that's the one thing that I read within Portugal and Amsterdam, is that they said that was a really big thing. And a lot of the patients that they talked to were like, I did need to get pushed. I really didn't want to go to jail. I felt shame all the time. So they didn't make me feel shame. But once I got clean, if I, because the drug courts do that, right? They do a urinalysis. They do meet with cops. They do meet with. So where does that happen for you as a clinician? Where do you see that most effective as an efficacy to get people to the point where they're clean? And then if they do fall off, they're not put in prison, but they are mandated. Hey, no. We're not going to let you go down that path again. You need to come back and you need to go to therapy for X amount of time. Like, where is that line for you as a clinician?
Yeah, I think it certainly, I mean, I've looked a bit to the literature, but also my own experience. And there's really, literature is mixed, but what we know doesn't work is like very very heavy punitive models that force, like we think of it as kidnapping, but the sort of force, like grabbing someone and taking, like, again, humiliating them at their workplace. They see them on TV sometimes, these big interventions. And again, that's quite traumatizing. Like when we interview youth who've been through that afterwards, it's very traumatizing. And then again, that's just building trauma on trauma. You talked about your brother in jail, the violence people experience in jail. It's a very violent act to like force someone into treatment. So the literature is pretty clear that generally that backfires, and it might work for 6 months, a year, but often those kids will go on to die. And what it drives them away from their support system. And so again, like then they turn away from their parents and their family, and those become not a safe space. And so what you want is for people to be able to have open, honest conversations about their substance use and their relapse. Again, if you reframe it all, like what's causing people to overdose? Part of it is the black market and the gangsterism and the fact that there's tainted drugs there. So and I guess for me, like the concept of clean, people use it often. It really depends. Everyone's different, but I've found a way to continue to use substances, whether it be alcohol, caffeine, maybe stimulants occasionally, as someone who also has ADHD. And, but the stimulant I have access to when I need to write a paper is a prescription stimulant. And whereas as a youth, I used to probably seek out, cocaine because I was looking for that same effect. But now I can have that discussion with my physician. I have a diagnosis, and I don't take ADHD medicine all the time. But if I need to focus and do a period of writing, I have access to that. And I'm not worried. My husband's not going to find me one night as a former cocaine user, like, come home and find me not well. And that's sort of the difference. Like what I question, because humans have used mind altering substances at the beginning of time.
Yes.
So why are we trying to force people to never use them? Like the Romans write about it. If you've ever used, many people in the Summit community that we talk about use psychedelics. Ayahuasca. And this is like, if you're middle class and you can afford to go to the jungle, that's okay. Or upper class. But it's not okay for other people to want to use different things. And everyone's body's different. And some people, like an opioid, just chills them out and relaxes them. And many of the things that we think of are bad don't make sense. Like alcohol is a known carcinogen. It's cancer causing. If we regulated drugs based on their true harm, we would have a very different approach. And so what many harm reductionists believe is that we need a public health approach grounded in evidence to substances. And that actually, if you really unpack, a lot of it is stigma. And would people need these forced treatments if you had a destigmatizing? But I do agree with you. Clinically, I've seen some people say, I really like some accountability. So what I do in my practice, and some sites, we say, do you think it would be helpful for you to have urine drug screens? And we try to have a consent-based approach to it. And some people say, yeah, you know what? I think that would actually help me like stay on top of myself. Just like with my PhD supervisor, I said, I need a meeting with you every 2 weeks because I'm a procrastinator. And it would be helpful if you are looking over my shoulder.
Yeah, you're behind. Yeah, okay.
I think that's different than forcing someone or kidnapping them or forcing them to do something. And again, having these consent-based conversations with patients and family members around, hey, I'm going to check in on you. Like you can even do that with your friends, but in having when people get this in and out of rehab and tons of expectation on them, then they hide. And that's when they die, because then they're so scared and everyone thinks that it's perfect. And that's the reflection of the friends I've lost. I've lost many friends and many colleagues. And we do have but we also, like, is San Francisco's issue and the overdoses they're having the result of some of these policies, or it's bigger than that? Like we also have more toxic drug supplies on the West Coast because we are the gateway. COVID didn't do us any favors. It made the supply more toxic. And so sometimes on other parts of the country, you'll have different supplies, and it's sort of just, it's not something that one mayor or council can be held responsible for. It's because we're trying to live in this, black market gangster culture where that's where people have to get their drugs. And what would it look like if there was a safe community center where the Tenderloin is that was big enough and nice enough, and there was jobs for everybody that wanted one, or everybody that I very much doubt that if you were like, I'd like detox today, you can get free, high quality, evidence-based entry immediately. Maybe you can, but we don't have that in my city. Like, it's still several months. If you want a stay in residential, which can sometimes be helpful just to help clear and, get you onto the OAT and do the titration as an inpatient, that does work. And then go back into the outpatient model. We haven't actually used the model, and we're cherry picking and saying, oh, they're doing this and they're doing that. But actually, So
that's a great way of looking at it, because like individually, there's a guy named Del Seymour who used to be a pimp here in San Francisco, and I've invited him on the show 3 times. Hasn't accepted my invite yet, but he's been chronicled in the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. He's just a mensch, just a really good dude. And he actually set up a program to teach homeless people how to code. And the reason for that is that they can code from anywhere. They don't have to smell good. They don't have to look good. They just have to work. And that gives them purpose and dignity and all of those things. But to your point, and this is kind of where I think we have to figure this out collectively. When you say we're not doing it right, this is collective. We're not doing it right. Yeah. So Vancouver's doing pieces and parts. San Francisco's doing pieces and parts. And maybe we can just say that the ones that did it as a collective, Portugal and Amsterdam, right? It worked.
Yeah. It did worked nationally, and they funded it, and they had a campaign. Yes. And again, when you do it piecemeal, I think you're not wrong that sometimes people come, but people also send, and there's evidence around this. I mean, from other jurisdictions, they will send people who are homeless on bus tickets from more conservative jurisdictions to our city, partly because they can sleep outside, and it's like a way to get out of their jurisdiction, get them out of their hair. And, when you have not enough nationally, but just enough to be a beacon, it can be a challenge. So you really need the other jurisdictions to set up and to sort of step up and be bringing some of the innovation that other cities are doing. And it needs to be a national response. I mean, Portugal is a pretty small country, and
it is.
I had the chance to see some of their streams as I went to their drug court. So we had the International Harm Reduction Conference there, and I've met with some of the judges and some of the residents. I've seen the models, and they did it on a national scale, and they educated families, and they brought people along. And that same thing happened in Switzerland during the heroin trials, and people understood. People saw the benefit of it because they saw reduced crime in their neighborhood. They saw people returning to their loved ones. But they also were in a different time with less toxic drugs. So what they were mainly working with
good point.
Was heroin. And heroin is easier. Pretty easy. Like, it is.
That's it. I read a paper on that exactly. And it said exactly that. It was a different time, that it was heroin, and heroin was it subsidones, or what is the
methadone or
methadone subs. Yeah, so you can replace that with purity. Yeah, and you can titrate them, to your point, and then they can actually get better. Whereas with fentanyl and all of these toxic drugs that are being passed around today, it's instant death, very sick, brain damage. You're not getting better. Yeah, and so that's a great, because the obviously to try to get to like what is missing, what are we getting wrong. What we're getting wrong as a collective, and this is North America in general, is that we have more kids today anxious and depressed. We have more homeless in the major cities that I've talked about already. We do not have a collective national attention or remedy, budget-wise. And to your point, that happens all the time to LA, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. It is in part due to the weather. Right? Minnesota, where I grew up, there's not as many homeless people because it's, right now 10 below zero, very difficult to be there. So if you can get to a warmer state, Vancouver obviously has the same issue. So it's getting worse everywhere. And that's what scares me to death for all these young kids, is that they are using more drugs with less safety. Like they're actually, they have no idea what they're ingesting.
Their natural experimentation is actually could kill them, which terrifies
Yeah, and
me
right, the
as the mother of
not
two
developed.
sons. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they make bad decisions until the the prefrontal cortex grows to an adult. And I have an 11 and 9-year-old little boy, and I'll tell you the only good thing about the Tenderloin is that I drive through it to and from school every day, and they see it. And so I let them know, guys, you know, my oldest is going to go to junior high next year, and I said, hey, there's going to be guys that want to do drugs next year. You're going to see it in school, and they're going to offer you drugs. Just look at this, dude. This is it. This is what happens. And I said, and you don't know, you know, my family, my brother and my father, and there's other people that were addicted. And I said, you know, you guys, there's good and bad with being a Dumont. You know, you have some good lineage and you have some bad lineage. And the last thing you want to do is experiment to see if you two are an addict, like your Uncle Stevie. So just no is the only answer. You know, it's like, this is what happens. Right. And so I think that, because I would just be curious with you guys in specifically your academic life. Is that something you guys are talking about at the national scale? I mean, you guys have Justin Trudeau. So you want to talk about someone who has a very big heart and really wants to help. Are you guys doing this nationally? Because I don't see a lot. I don't see a lot of chance for that for us. But are you guys doing it?
Yeah, I think there is certainly always hope, and you know, you have NIDA, the National Addictions Office, and there's a lot of evidence we take from U.S. jurisdictions. And Carl Hart is someone, if you don't know Carl, he's a fantastic scientist that we follow a lot, and was also has a former history as someone that used substances, and then became a professor at Columbia, and he writes a lot about the power of community and how
he's great. Yeah,
how you can kind of move on. But I think there's lots of reason to have hope at the same time. And one of the other things, you know, we talked about San Francisco's weather and then there's some papers on this of the things we have in common. The other thing that we have in common is extreme housing prices. So again, all of these policy instruments are huge. And that means, like, maybe in other jurisdictions, there are more like lower middle class and middle class people that are not taking the housing away from the very low barrier, because it's just impossible. And so that's what creates homelessness, is these really disparate, out of control housing markets. So I think both provincially and federally, we're really trying to tackle that, because we see that as a root cause of a lot of even anxiety and homelessness, like being constantly evicted. When houses become a commodity like that, people are constantly evicted, and then it's the impacts of the pandemic and working on a sort of build back better approach where we understand the impacts of children and youth of these sort of times away from school and the anxiety they faced. And then how do we get enough dosage? Because you can't just have these little pilot programs here and there. Like, you have to have on-demand access to free counseling, free, whether that's virtual or not. And, you know, if medication's needed, you know, you need it as silent. So you need a national pharmacare plan, which is something we are nationally working on, so that
you guys are. Okay.
Yeah, that's one of the planks of the upcoming, and that's an election promise that they made recently, and a plank they're looking at. And then definitely as a national drug strategy and a housing strategy. And, you know, budgets are tight everywhere around the world post-COVID, and many jurisdictions went into deficit, but it's like not cheaping out on these things that will actually be the foundation and bedrock of better health for all. And that's, you know, addiction is a complicated thing, but what again, I keep going back to is the little things you can do, whether you're supporting a loved one or a colleague or you're a policymaker. You can treat people with dignity. You can be a safe space for your loved one. You can build community. You can employ people. Like, if you're an employer and you're in a private sector, you can remove the mandatory urine drug screens. Because do you really care that your employee used cocaine on a Saturday night at their house? Why is that your business? And you can remove restrictions that you might have had about people having criminal charges. Like, collectively, there's so much human rights work, again, that you can do even as an employer or a community builder. You can make your business welcoming to people, take out the black lights, give people a cup of coffee, smile, like walking past and smiling and saying hello. I do it every time I walk past a homeless person. I often will give a bit of change, because if they use it to buy some drugs, I don't have a judgment on that. And that it's amazing how happy they are And I just say, hey, brother, hey, sister, hey, friend. And people are like, shocked, because even in a compassionate, like, think we have a compassionate city, nobody looks them in the eye.
No.
And so there's just so many little things that if as a society we can reduce our stigma towards people who use drugs, and then that allows, whether you're conservative or Democrat or whatever your political stripes are, to agree, like, we have all been touched by addiction in our families. And how can it be that sort of fear and mistrust and anger is the answer? And libertarians get this. Libertarians, many, if they're conservative libertarians, are like, we don't want government intervention in whether it's our guns or our houses, but why do you want them in your substances and what you're putting up your nose? So I often wonder, when very conservative friends they often are like trying to make these punitive drug policy, or they're not supporting harm reduction. And I'm like, well, if you look at your core values, people should have the liberty to use what they want. And so we'll often build alliances in the harm reduction and drug policy movement, the public health drug policy movement, with those conservative. We work really hard to work with conservative politicians. We had Stephen Harper here as a conservative prime minister for many years, and we, give them tours of the sites and explain the model. I mentioned the bridges we built with the Chinese community because our Tenderloin equivalent, which is called the downtown side, is also just next to Chinatown. And, they had legitimate concerns about safety. And when we could bring them in, they've been some of our best champions. And those alliances across different communities are crucial for the success of a really an evidence-based public health approach to drugs.
And so as a group, Canada is trying this national approach, budgetary wise or not.
Say there's a ways to go. We have, like you, different governments in power. You have states, we have provinces, and we have some very different political views across the provinces. And that can sometimes lead to sort of rapid changes and flip-flops in policy. So where we had made some ground, you go backwards. Often in the movement that happens. So it's
Sure.
certainly not perfect here, but I think the decriminalization bill that came through, as I mentioned a couple of days ago, is sort of the first time we're looking at what would it look like to remove this criminal element that we know creates so much trauma from the equation. And BC's moving forward as a pilot with that. And I think that's going to be really interesting. We're all very open to say, hey, we want to evaluate it. We're explicitly looking at what might be some of the unintended harms. And it would be brilliant if there was a North American approach, because we know that the drugs move between borders and that, again, we don't want to be a draw from one to another. So it is much better if nationally there can be conversations about stigma towards drug use and towards compassionate approaches.
Two things there, and then I'll let you go. And I appreciate your time again. I interviewed a police officer yesterday about this topic, and I asked him, who's someone who spent a lot of time on the street as a beat cop, and then he retired as a lieutenant, and he's someone that I go to often to ask him questions about this kind of stuff. And I said, buddy, what do you think is the remedy here? Because, and he's a former cop, so he said, I agree with you that we can't put people in jail on drugs right away, but there has to be a limit. After a certain amount of time and a certain amount of offenses, 2, 3, 4, but he said the problem is because he spent so much time as a cop. He said jail is awful. It will wreck them. Prison's worse. So that's the issue with the punitive, state of mind. What he said, and I don't know if you guys are doing this because we're not, is that we have to figure out a way to incarcerate addicts only. And I don't know if that looks like, because in Norway, it's not a prison. It's like a work situation. There's no barbed wire, and there's, people are learning how to do a job, whether it's automotive or carpentry or whatever it may be. And that's kind of what he was. And I was like, that's a really good idea, because it's that way. You go to therapy or you go to this work camp. And the work camp itself is where you need to remain clean, but you're going to be trained on how to do these things. And you're not going to be housed with, sexual predators and murderers and people that are violent, right? You're going to be with other folks who are dealing with the same plight. which is in this case addiction, substance abuse, self-loathing, all the things that we all know. Are you guys doing anything on that front in Vancouver in the sense of trying to get your jails and prisons cleaned up to some degree and or work on some level of like a Norway type treatment center where you're actually sending your addicts to a place of comfort to get better?
Certainly, we do have some recovery communities, they're sometimes called, or therapeutic centers, and Italy also has some really best practices in this area. And I'll have to follow up with the name of it, but there's a model around work. So
in
we
Italy?
In Italy.
Check that out.
But we have some communities like that, like our Redfish Healing Center is like that. Used to be essentially a notorious, very traumatizing place called Riverview that was our mental health sort of warehousing facility. And it was a secure facility, but there was a lot of bad things that happened there. And there was a policy decision to completely abandon that approach. And they actually, in the 80s, let everyone free when the abuse came out. And then there was a bunch of people with a really profound and persistent, very serious mental health challenges. And then they, in our version of the Tenderloin, which is the downtown east side. So again, these are like bad policy decisions that had unintended consequences and that we still live with today. And instead, some in consultation with family members and in consultation with even sometimes the people affected, they need a very secure living environment that may be acquired brain injury, which again, we're seeing more and more with repeated non-fatal overdoses. And some of those people do benefit from these very intensive therapeutic environments. And it may be for a period of time for their brain to heal, and it may be permanently. And so we need, again, to have those spaces for people. Many people talk about having connection to land. So we have a lot of land-based healing. So our indigenous, I shouldn't say we have a lot. We have some very interesting, and we need more land-based healing environments. And that's particularly for indigenous people to reconnect with culture, led by elders. They do sweat. They do like living off the land, hunting, fishing,
like nature
skills. Yeah. And they get back to nature. They learn to connect with their culture, and primarily have a period of abstinence while they're there. And these are very possible, strong evidence behind many of these interventions. And so I think there's a lot we could learn from those. Again, people farming, all of those are quite well established in the literature as like just reconnecting. We have inner city farms, and often as a nurse, it's like the first thing I do is not figure out how to get you clean. I'm like, how can I get you connected? Is it volunteering? So I was a street nurse for many years and worked outreach. So similar to Beat Cop, but my tools were not handcuffs. They were, my phone. And I was just basically connecting people. Sometimes I drew blood I was also helping people if they had HIV, and was getting people onto medications and giving people treatments and dressing wounds. And so I just had a big bag. It said street nurse, and you walk in the downtown side, our version of the Tenderloin, and you learn a lot from doing that. And again, if people ask me for help, it often was wanting to reconnect with family, like helping people make a phone call, find their kids, and then getting them a safe place to stay. And then once when they come to see you in the office, it's like, how can we get you volunteering? How can we get you connected to land? How can we get you working at inner city farm? How can we get you yoga? Like, how come only middle class people get yoga?
Right.
Again, it's like, how do we spread out these interventions that we know work? And my personal perspective is that like having a clean urine drug screen is not necessarily the most important part. It's like, did you have these visits with your family? Did you reconnect with your daughter you've lost touch with? Did you call your lawyer to get access? Like those are more steps on the healing journey. And then making sure that if they do have a slip up, that they're not alone, that there's naloxone, and that there's things that can revive them, or that ideally they had a baseline of an OAT so that it didn't even happen. And those are all tools that, again, you don't need this like clean, not clean binary. Or like, did you get your life back? And even for my own kids, I mean, it's terrifying. We have one of the highest overdose rates because of the toxicity of our supply. And my oldest is in his 20s and my youngest is 13. And, since he was really since they were in early teens, I taught my son when he was, I think, 15 to use naloxone and to how to revive someone. And I did it as, hey, in case you're at a party and this happens, you can save a life. But that was also an entry to having that conversation. And I didn't necessarily want to say like, or in case you use drugs, but because I'm like, my hope is you won't. I also had the same conversations, like addiction runs in our family. There is biological elements to that sometimes that are genetic. And, but having clear, conversations and open conversations about how experimentation is somewhat normal, but that this is the risk in this current climate. And if you're at a party and this happens, and so he carries it with him and he has it in his car, and he's had to revive people in his work.
He has
in film,
wow.
not friends, but I mean, I think he was at a workshop with a teacher and the teacher didn't know how to do it. And he took over and taught the class. And like, those are things as a mom that make me really proud, and that he has the tools, he needs. And then, intervening as a parent early. And if they need counseling because they're going through something, whether it's bullying or challenge at school, just being really on top of your kids, but also the number one sort of preventative thing for kids, addiction, mental health. One of the great literature pages is actually having protective factors and sports clubs, engagement, same like adults. Like if you're busy, you don't need substances to kind of keep you through. And so having, your boys in soccer is probably actually one of the greatest interventions you can do as a parent, or whatever it is they're making for their passion. And so that's that, plus like a passionate parenting and not being too strict and being there if there's a challenge. Those are what prevent substance use in youth, and then having transparent conversations.
Yeah, well, those are all good. And I'm going to have to change my intro because I had you as a former nurse, but you are as you said, a actual active nurse, which now with all your education, they call you a clinical scientist, which I think is brilliant. And I just want to thank you again. It was great meeting you, and I've had a wonderful time talking with you over breakfast and drinks at the summit. But I love what you're doing. Our world needs more Meaghan Thumaths out there. And I wish you nothing but continued success, not only in your individual practice, but, I'm rooting for Vancouver, because if you guys can pull off a prototype, of a nationalistic program that is working for addiction, it's really necessary here in Northern California. So, Godspeed to you and everything you're doing, Meaghan. And thanks again for coming on the program. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Cheers.